Come before you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Pentecost, the day the gospel went viral. A day when we recall the movement of the Holy Spirit through the disciples and a profound example of what happens when we make room for God to move in our lives. It is for us, some they declare it the birth of the church, although I would say that the church was born when the first people gathered and proclaimed a belief in God. And I think even this is borne true in the readings because the great multitude is assembled in Jerusalem because there are a faithful group out of which our Messiah emerges. They're gathered there for another festival. In conjunction with Passover, some celebrate the harvest, or Shavuot. And so there are people from many places all gathered together. And so the disciples take this as an opportunity to proclaim what they have experienced of the gospel and of the risen Christ who stood before them and reminded them that the work was now theirs to do. And they went forth like a bunch of bumbling idiots, not knowing what to expect. This is how they let me preach. And God worked through them despite themselves. And each heard in their own native language. What a gift is that? What a tremendous gift to hear the good news of Jesus in the language of your heart and mind and not have to translate as you hear it. What a gift is that? And with it, we have this fantastic passage paired from Genesis where the language of the earth had been one and had been confused. And I think it's probably fair to go and take a closer look at both of these as kind of bookends because I think sometimes with the scriptures we get these themes that work their way through and thread their way through the course of human history. And we can see on the one end of our scriptures an event that changes things for all of humanity and how God works through that sometime later to offer some other event that draws our attention to God and the gospel anew. And so as we look at this passage in Genesis, it's probably one that's at least somewhat familiar to us, this Tower of Babel passage where people had learned to make bricks and they were rather excited about what they might be able to do with them. Like a child with their first set of Legos, seeing just how high they can stack them before they tip over. Yeah, we've used some Legos in Sunday school recently, and we've used them to illustrate some of the Bible passages, but I haven't seen pictures yet, but I hope that at some point we build a tower as tall as the room that they're in, just as and we could illustrate this story rather well with that. And I think sometimes we get ahead of ourselves because we think about the story in a particular way or we come to it with a certain expectation. We think the story of the Tower of Babel as those naughty people who did a bad thing as they tried to build a tower to the heavens, or maybe even declare that they were trying to take over the heavens. But I have to give a little bit of the benefit of the doubt to those who learned to make bricks. Because I think when you first learn to make bricks, you'd have to think of it as almost like a gift from God, this newfound wisdom and the capacity to build in ways that you've never been able to build before. And so I think it's a natural inclination, a genuine, innate human curiosity that leads them to think, I wonder just how tall we could build something now, right? So maybe they set out with good intentions and then got off track. And at that point, I hope that we can all put ourselves directly in the shoes of those people we read about in Genesis. Because all too often, we're gifted with something, a gift from God, a talent, an opportunity. and we see the riches of what's offered, and we get excited about the opportunity, and our imaginations run wild as to what might happen with this newfound gift. And then somewhere along the way, we get off track. And it's the humans that write the story, so they get to blame God for the confusion of language, but I have to say, we're perfectly capable of doing that all on our own. Just travel across this country sometime and pop in different places and see if you can understand every word that your server or other workers might say or speak before you. Even if it's all English, it might be a challenge to understand it all. Having traveled around just a little, this is an experience that sometimes you think, you have to turn to your spouse or the people you're traveling with, and what did they say? I always like those conversations because it's fun to realize that our very being is expressed through, what do we say? They put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. I mean, there's this notion that we can rearrange things even if it's all the same language. And so it's not hard to imagine how the languages got confused, whomever's to blame. I think we probably did it on our own and then blamed God after the fact. Yeah, God came down and confused the language. That's why the tower never got built. Sometimes when we're gifted with something, we get a little off track somewhere along the way as our ego swells. There's not enough room for God to work through it. As Jesus comes and walks this earth, part of what the message Christ offers is if we are able to retract our egos a little, we might see the light of God within us. And if we're able to shrink back from that and retract our ownership over those things that we hold so dearly, that maybe God will have the opportunity through the power of the Holy Spirit to work through us things even greater than if we tried to take ownership of the whole thing ourselves. And so, as the festival began and people from all around the region flooded into Jerusalem, the disciples knew they had an opportunity, and they couldn't help themselves but to go and speak of Jesus, the risen Lord. Little did they know what would be accomplished that day. They left room for God to work through what they offered, and something magnificent happened. In that gathering, each heard this message of salvation in their own tongue, in the language of their heart. And it transformed them. And they, in response, became followers of Christ themselves. Maybe you make a good brick. Maybe the brick that you make isn't a brick at all. Maybe it's something else entirely. And maybe as you set out with those bricks that you're making, we get a little off course here and there. And my hope is that this day of Pentecost may serve as a reminder that we will always do our best brick making in community, watching out for one another to ensure that there's room for God to work through it with us, to prevent us from allowing our egos to take up so much space that there's not enough room for God to enter into things with us. That as we come together as the people of God, ready to profess the ways that God has changed our lives indefinitely, and we might go forward with a plan, yes, but also leaving room for God to join us in it. That through that indwelling Spirit, we might be united as one. That we might profess our faith in the one Lord who gives us the opportunity to share a love that knows no bounds.